Legal shifts and regulatory pressures in the ERP space, the new tech laws of 2026, and the digital transformation mistakes that CFOs often make. Those are just a few of the topics we'll cover here in episode 256 of Transformation Ground Control.
Welcome to Transformation Ground Control. Ground Control. The podcast that covers everything related to digital transformation. This podcast features technology agnostic and international discussions related to digital strategy, software selection, implementation, change management, business process optimization, and everything else you need to know to make your digital transformation project successful. Whether you're embarking on an ERP implementation, supply chain transformation, or any other business or digital transformation, this podcast is for you. Now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Ground control to Major Tom.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, the podcast that is tech agnostic, covers everything related to digital transformation, including the strategy, people, process, and technology aspects of change and transformation. Thank you for being here today, whether you're going through an ERP or an AI or a CRM or any other sort of digital transformation project. This podcast is for you, and we're going to cover all the things in this podcast that we think you need to know and will be interested in hearing as it relates to your digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent tech agnostic consulting provider that helps clients throughout the world manage their digital transformation initiatives. We also help them ensure that they de-risk those projects and maximize the value of their investments in technology. Joining me, as always, is our co-host, Darian Chwialkowski. Darian, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for today's episode.
Yeah, we've got a lot of interesting stuff we're going to cover here today in our second episode of 2026, and some very forward-thinking, looking to the future, looking to the rest of this year, and looking past 2026 types of issues or topics we're going to cover here today. First of all, we're going to get into some questions we've received on social media. We'll get to some of those questions from the mailbag, so to speak, on social media. And then we'll get into some of our newsworthy topics. We're going to talk about how Texas is set to create a council to monitor certain uses of AI. We're going to talk about the new tech laws of 2026. And then later in the show, speaking of laws, we're going to have Marcus Harris, who's an attorney, a software attorney. He's going to be joining us on the show to talk about legal shifts, regulatory pressures, and the future of cloud ERP. We'll talk about some of the emerging legal and regulatory trends and shifts that are changing that you should be aware of if you're an enterprise tech buyer and or a leader for digital transformation. And then finally, later in the show, we will talk about the digital transformation and ERP mistakes that CFOs make and the ones you want to avoid. So we'll talk about that later today as well. So before we get to all that, Darian, what are some of the social media questions you have for us today?
Yeah, some good questions today. The first one is, Eric, for all of these ERP failures, has there ever been any calculations on what the cost would be if they didn't do it?
Yeah, so in other words, the cost of doing nothing, how does that compare to the cost of failure?
I would assume that's what he's asking, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, typically when we put together a business case for our clients as part of their strategy and evaluation process and just the overall planning process, we do look at the cost of doing nothing. You know, what is this costing you to not upgrade your technology? And then we also look at what is the cost benefit of potentially investing in technology. And so, you know, you have to look at it from a risk adjusted perspective. We typically, when we put together our business cases, we don't assume or hope for the best. We don't assume that things are going to be perfect, but we do assume that an organization is going to do the right things to avoid failure. We typically don't do a business case assuming that there's going to be a big, massive, catastrophic failure and then compare that to the cost of doing nothing. Although I would think that the cost of failure is probably going to far exceed the cost of doing nothing, because what we found, one metric I do have, so short answer is no, we have not measured, at least I don't know of anyone else that's measured it. I'd love to hear feedback from the audience if you know something I don't, which may be possible. There may be metrics out there that quantify this better than what I have. But the metric I do have from our research at Third Stage is that the cost of failure itself, the actual implementation cost, the overruns, the increased budgetary blowups, those sorts of things. Those are very costly. That alone can double or triple your initial estimate pretty easily. But that's not the real risk. That's not the real cost. The real cost is what happens at go live. What happens after you've had this failure, you've paid for this failure, then what happens to your business operations after that? We found that it could be anywhere from 3 to 4 times what you spent on the implementation. You might pay an additional 3 to 4 times that just on operational disruption and costs that are incurred as a result of a failed project. So for example, if you can't ship product and customers start canceling orders, there's a real price tag associated with that. What does that cost you? If you can't ship product for a month, what would that cost you? And unfortunately, that's the logic too few organizations and leaders think about. Not that you want to quantify and assume the worst in your business case, but instead what you should be thinking about is how can we make sure that doesn't happen? Because a failure is a lot more expensive than just doing it right the first time and having an effective implementation. And that's really what you want to focus on is what is the cost benefit of an effective implementation, assuming you do it right, and how does that compare to doing nothing? Now, if you decide you do want to move forward with the digital transformation and the ROI still makes sense, then it's imperative that you do it right. Otherwise, your business case was just a pipe dream. It was just a smoke and mirror academic exercise that had no grounding in reality if you don't follow the prescriptive way that you would need to be successful in these projects. So that's what I would say to that is I don't have any specific data at a grand broad scale other than to say it can cost anywhere from 3 to 4 times the initial cost of implementation just in paying for the failure post implementation.
Yeah, definitely. That's super interesting. I've never had or seen any questions like that come across. So that was super interesting to dive into. But I want to get into our next question today, which is on the critical Rimini Street support alternative. Customers do not get access to SAP core code, unlike Oracle. If this is still true, how does a company manage country-specific legal updates, for example, in Brazil? Additionally, how are SAP declared vulnerabilities patched? Is Rimini able to cover these two situations?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I did see that come through social media, and I actually asked Rimini Street, my executive level contact at Rimini asked that question. In fact, I tagged him in that particular post on LinkedIn to have him comment on it. And the short answer that I'll paraphrase, and hopefully I'll be mostly accurate in my paraphrasing of his response. But his response was correct. We do not get access to SAP source code, but you don't need access to the source code. What you need access to is your customization code. So if you've customized anything, that's what they can manage and they can help you fix. The source code itself is very stable, especially if you're using ECC or R3. Those products have been around forever. So they're pretty well battle tested. They're proven. They work. The things that typically break or cause problems from a support perspective are usually the customizations. So that's what they manage. And they also do the same with security patches as well. So yeah, I guess the advantage of working with SAP is they do have access to the direct source code as far as if you were to continue using SAP for your maintenance for at least the time being until they discontinue it. But the point that Rimini Street makes is you don't really need access to the source code because you're not going to change the source code itself. You're going to change or fix customizations that you've already done, potentially, presumably. So that's my understanding.
Yeah, definitely. Well, great that you got insight directly from Rimini Street for that question itself. Definitely super helpful there. But I want to switch gears here and get into more what's happening in 2026 with AI or any laws or anything like that that's kind of going on. We have a couple different articles for this today. The first one is about Texas specifically and how they're creating an AI council. So Texas just passed a law to create an AI advisory council. This is an aggressive regulation and it's not enforcement heavy. It's a signal. The state is formalizing AI oversight without actually restricting much of anything yet. The council's job is to study how AI is used inside state agencies, surface risks, and recommend future guardrails if needed. No penalties, no reinforcement, no private sector clampdown. That's by design. And this feels like governments are doing what a lot of enterprises are doing right now, forming AI councils, because not having governance feels risky when no one's quite sure exactly what the rules should be yet. And it's a way to look proactive without locking into decisions that might be wrong a year from now. It quietly normalizes the idea that AI needs oversight before anyone defines what good oversight actually is. So, really, this article is saying that in Texas, it's not about controlling AI today, it's about buying time and creating a formal place to learn, advisory first, enforcement later, maybe. Eric, with all of this, what does an advisory body like this turn into in real regulation, and what triggers that shift?
It's interesting to hear all these different states that have their own way of tackling AI. I know the US federal government recently issued an order that states can't, for the time being anyway, they can't, individual states in the United States can't issue their own legal restrictions on AI. It has to be at the federal level. But it makes you wonder if every state in the United States is issuing their own guidance or doing their own boards, AI boards. And then you look at every country in the world, the 200 plus countries in the world doing their own thing with AI. How do you navigate that? At some point, we've all got to come together and have sort of a common understanding of how AI is going to look and work in our society as a whole, across the world. But to answer your question more directly, I don't know at what point we shift from committees and investigative understanding into let's put rules and regulations and laws in place. I see why the governments throughout the world are doing this, and not just in Texas, but not just in the United States, but other parts of the world as well. A lot of the markets we operate in, like Europe and Middle East and Asia Pacific, we're seeing a lot of the same things in those countries as well, where some of those countries are investigating and trying to explore what AI should look like in the future. And I think it's a valid concern and question, because AI, more than any other technology we've ever seen in human history, is going to be more disruptive. I think we as a society were afraid of robots. We were afraid of computers. We've been afraid of technology in the past, but AI just feels different. It feels like it just has more of it just is going to be more impactful. Whether it's positive or negative or both is yet to be determined. And I think that's what governments are trying to understand. So the short answer is I don't know. I don't know at what point or how we shift from AI committees into more heavy-handed oversight and regulation. We're going to talk about that in the enterprise tech space in general with Marcus here in just a few moments, not focused on AI necessarily, but more focused on just enterprise tech in general. But that is a good question that I think I'd have to punt on that and say, let's come back to that question in the future, because we'll probably know more in the coming months.
For sure. And just for CIOs and CFOs that are reading these different articles that are coming out, what signals this when shaping internal AI governance for their companies today?
Yeah, I think now that's a different story. But at the company level, I think you do have to have AI governance and a deliberate strategy for how you're going to use AI. There's a lot of hype around it right now at the leadership level, especially within boardrooms. We hear about a lot. Investors are interested in seeing how their portfolio companies are using AI, because presumably it's going to make them more profitable, more effective, more able to potentially reduce headcounts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's on the surface, but then that hype doesn't translate into, well, what does it mean? What does AI mean to our organization? How are we going to use it? What's acceptable? What's not? What are the privacy concerns? How are we going to handle employee displacement and employee stress and impact and all that stuff? Those are all things that companies have to determine at their own individual level, because every company is going to have a different strategy for it. So I think it's important for leaders to understand that it's you've got to be a lot more actively involved as a leader, even more so than you would be for like an ERP or a cloud migration or a more traditional technology project. Even more so, this is true with AI, that you have to be heavily involved, because you have to set the guardrails, you have to set the vision, you have to set the direction for how AI is going to be used in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know earlier you mentioned some laws that got passed recently about AI and states being able to make regulations and everything like that. That's actually what our next article today is all about. So I want to switch gears and get into that. Here's kind of like, I know you mentioned it a little bit, but here is what this article was saying. It said the US government recently issued an AI executive order. While it sounds like it's about AI specifically, it's really about something bigger, preventing fragmented state-by-state approach to AI regulation. States started kind of moving first when it comes to this regulation. They began drafting and passing their own AI laws. And now the federal government is stepping in, trying to regain control and eventually create more uniform national standards. It's what's important here is that it doesn't immediately override the state laws. Companies still have to comply what's on the books today, but it clearly signals that federal preemption is coming, and we just don't know exactly when or what that looks like. But it creates kind of a tough environment, obviously, for everybody to manage here, as we've seen. On the one hand, you can't definitely like just wait around for that clarity from the federal government, but the state rules are already being enforced in some different states. So what's interesting is they're not banning AI, obviously. They're not saying you can't use certain technologies. Instead, they're emphasizing transparency, disclosure, risk management, documentation, and accountability. And so, really, they're just wanting to make sure people are using it responsibly. But, Eric, with all of this, one, just like what were your general thoughts when this got passed? And obviously, you knew about it already. So, just wanting to hear your general thoughts.
Well, my first reaction was, can the federal government do that? I mean, the whole point of the way the U.S. government is established is that so states can have their own laws and their own oversights in certain areas. I think AI, I agree that AI is such a big worldwide issue that you need some sort of consistency. So I actually agree with federal governments and potentially even, you look at the EU in Europe. I think the EU is going to be in a good position to provide continuity and consistency in how AI is regulated or managed in Europe. But the rest of the world, for the most part, is going to have a very fragmented approach, which we don't need any more fragmentation more than we're already going to have. We don't need 50 variations in the US. We need one. And then you're going to have 200 other variations worldwide, or maybe less when you count the EU as one instead of 20 different countries or whatever. But anyway, so that's my view of that. Is I think there does need to be some deliberate understanding. I just hope something you asked earlier in a previous episode, another topic we covered, is whether or not that stifles innovation. So if the government gets too involved or too heavy-handed or prematurely without fully understanding the facts, if they get too excitable about regulating, that could stifle innovation. It could make things worse. So I think so far it seems like most governments are handling it with a cautious optimism. They're not freaking out and stepping in too aggressively, but they are forming these committees. They are trying to get some real loose, broad stroke sorts of guardrails in place, which I think is probably a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess stepping back from obviously there's a lot of legal details here. What do you think the AI executive order is really trying to accomplish at a federal level?
Well, I think it's the point we talked about in that previous episode. It's to ensure that innovation continues and that we give AI a chance to evolve. A lot of people are afraid of it taking over the world and taking our jobs and becoming our enemies and that sort of thing, which I don't think that'll happen. Maybe it will. So the maybe it will part of it is probably why governments are getting involved. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Definitely makes sense. And for organizations, do you think the bigger risk for them right now is over preparing for state laws that might get overridden, or under preparing because they're waiting for federal clarity? Where should organizations kind of stand when it comes to this?
It's a good question. I think, I don't think you can wait for the government to have clarity, because I think that's going to take years. And then there'll probably be legal court battles over stuff that we don't know how that all unfolds. So I think you just have to go on with your life, and unless there's some compelling, obvious, high risk, high likelihood risk, you can't do a bunch of what if, and there's only so much what if preparation you can do, because we don't know what if. We just don't know the answer of where we're headed. So you don't want to be stuck in the past. Maybe you don't want to go all in on AI right now, because you do want to be a little bit more cautious, a little bit more deliberate, a little bit more risk managed, which is fine. So I'd say going at an incremental, moderate pace is probably suitable for AI, knowing that there's a possibility it could all get overridden by some law in the future. But I think we're years away from that, and you have a business to run in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, super interesting. And I'm really excited for our guest today, because based on these topics today, we probably will have a lot of questions for him.
Yes, it's a repeat guest, longtime podcast guest. Actually, he was one of the very first guests we had on the show. Probably the second or third episode of this podcast back in 2020. or 2021, right in the throes of COVID when we started this podcast. He was one of the first guests. He's been on several times since then. It's Marcus Harris, who's an attorney, a software attorney that focuses on software contracts and legal actions related to software vendors and enterprise technology in general. So he's going to be on the show. We're going to talk about more legal stuff. Not surprisingly, we're going to talk about legal shifts, regulatory pressures, and how that relates to the future of cloud and ERP. We'll get into some AI stuff as well in that conversation. So be sure to stick around for that. It's going to be a great conversation. And then later in the show, after Marcus is on, we'll talk about the digital transformation and ERP mistakes that CFOs make. So we've got a lot more to cover in this episode. Be sure to stick around, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. I want to share a little bit of information about Third Stage Consulting and who we are. Third Stage Consulting Group is an independent, technology agnostic provider of consulting services to help clients through their digital transformations. We help with digital strategy and software selection, as well as implementation planning. And during implementation, we provide services related to program management, organizational change, business process improvement, as well as enterprise architecture. These are just some of the services we provide. We have offices in North America as well as Europe and Asia Pacific. So if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to check out our resource center, which includes a number of resources that will help you through your digital transformation, and you can access that for free using the QR code here or the links below. You can also reach out to me directly if you'd like to discuss your digital transformation and brainstorm ideas on how to improve where you're headed on your journey.
The last thing you want to have happen is for your digital transformation to end up in court. I've been doing this for 20 years and I have seen everything. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney focusing my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating software disputes across the country. Feel free to reach out to us at taftlaw.com. We'd love to talk to you about the litigation process and what you can expect.
Sometimes all I think about is you. Late nights in the middle of June. He always been faking me out. Can't make you happier now. Sometimes all I think about is you.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 256. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent, tech agnostic, and client-side digital transformation consulting provider. You can learn more about us at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also reach out to me if you'd like to learn about how we can help you de-risk your project, plan for a successful project, and execute a project. Or if you are having a troubled digital transformation, we can help you recover that and get it back on track. So be sure to reach out if you'd like to learn more about us. And speaking of risk and legal stuff, as we were talking about before the break, our next guest is an exciting one that I love having on the show. It's Marcus Harris, who is a software attorney. We're going to talk with him about the legal changing of winds, or the wind shifts as it relates to legal stuff and regulatory actions throughout the world. And we're going to talk about what that means to you as leaders of digital transformations and in the enterprise tech space in general. So all that being said, Marcus Harris, thanks for joining the show today.
Yeah, well, good. Once again, I'm glad to be here. And, I think, my frequency really goes to the topics that you're talking about. And it's just right in my practice area, my interest area. And I think you're one of the few, if not only, technology agnostic consulting firms that is putting out this kind of content. And I think it's a real benefit to the community, to the users. And I mean, from an educational standpoint, it's really, it's helpful to people. And I'm glad to be a part of it in a small way.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, glad to collaborate with you again on yet another episode. This is probably at least the sixth or seventh time you've been on this podcast over the last few years. And you do the same. You put out a lot of content. If you don't follow Marcus, be sure to follow him on LinkedIn. He's got a YouTube channel as well. He puts out a lot of great content, video content in particular. But before we dive into the questions that I have for you, Marcus, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Taft and just sort of your upbringing in the enterprise tech space.
Yeah, for those that don't know me, my name is Marcus Harris. I'm a partner at Taft out of their Chicago office, Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister. I focus my legal practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts, with a particular focus on large enterprise software deals and all the collateral agreements that go with those. And I've developed a real sweet spot in litigating these types of disputes when they go sideways. I mean, depending on the study that you look at, digital transformations, ERP implementation projects fail at, anywhere from 70, 75% of the time, and I think it depends on how you define failure, but there's certainly a lot there that comes across my desk, and we're involved on a virtually daily basis with either negotiating these contracts, litigating them. And we litigate against everybody: SAP, Oracle, Infor, all the names that you heard of, and a lot of the second, third tier names that you may not be as familiar with. But that's what I do. And like Eric said, I've got we put out a lot of content from an educational standpoint, and it's something I hope your users check out and they find value from.
Yeah, absolutely. And the topic we want to talk about here today is really an interesting one. And you and I were talking before we went live here today for this interview about how this is a pretty, it's a new topic. It's emerging. You and I don't have all the answers because it's such a new thing. And we're starting to see little smoke signals of things that might be coming in the future, in the not too distant future, and things that are emerging in this space. So this is not based on our typical conversations that you and I have had in the past around the current law as it stands today, around a specific lawsuit or lessons from lawsuits. This is more anticipating what might happen from a regulatory perspective worldwide. And there's a couple instances we're going to dive into in here in just a second that potentially foreshadow what might happen in this industry. But I'd love to hear from the audience too. I have two questions for the audience before we get going here, though. For those of you joining and listening here to us live, if you don't mind, just drop in the chat. First of all, what city and country are you joining from? I'd love to hear what city and country, what part of the world you're in, just so we can understand, what regulatory regime you might be a part of or report up to. But also, I'd love to hear just a simple yes/no question from the audience, just to maybe trigger some debate or conversation here. And that is, do you think the enterprise technology space should be or needs to be more regulated by government regulators? It's just, we're going to dive into that topic here today. Not to give our opinion necessarily, but to talk about some of the regulatory changes and shifts that are shifting in the world that lead us to think that might be something that's coming, whether we like it or not. So I'd love to hear from the audience here. What do you think? Yes or no? Should we have more regulation in the enterprise tech space, or is everything fine and we can self-regulate and we're good to go? Love to hear your thoughts on that. But a couple things that we want to dive into. There's really two primary regulatory shifts that we want to dive into. One is fairly directly related to the enterprise tech space. The other one is not related to the enterprise tech space, but it's related to the consumer tech space. And as I think you would agree, Marcus, typically business to consumer type stuff, anything that's consumer facing, typically will get regulated first. It's going to get the attention of regulators and government officials before B2B. And I think for whatever reason, governments just don't feel as bad for businesses when they get screwed or if they're taken advantage of, but they do feel bad when consumers get screwed. And let me start with the consumer one, and then I want to come back to the more directly related one that's directly related to the enterprise tech space. And there's something called the Digital Markets Act in the EU. And those of you that are in the EU, in fact, I've already seen a couple people comment here that are saying they've commented here that they're in the EU region. But there's something called the Digital Markets Act. And what this was, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but this is this was probably about 5 to 10 years ago that this all unfolded, where the EU went after and looked into companies like Google and Microsoft to understand whether or not they were stifling competition and whether or not they were giving consumers enough choices as it relates to technology. And I'm oversimplifying, I'm not getting into all the details, but I bring this up because even though that's consumer facing, it does make me wonder, and it makes me think about some of the same themes that we're seeing in the enterprise tech space. That leads me to think if the enterprise tech space is suffering from these same problems, then perhaps governments like the EU will eventually regulate for those same reasons the enterprise tech space. And one of the big things they talk about, two big things they talk about, are gatekeepers at the consumer level and interoperability. And gatekeepers being, do you have an option outside of, for example, Googling search results? Or if you I know now it's different with AI. We're not using Google as much perhaps in traditional search, but back in the early 2000s, we were using Google quite a bit. And the EU really looked into some of the behaviors of some of these gatekeepers like Google, and they determined that they were exerting too much power, too much influence over consumers. And then the other part of it was interoperability, and whether or not different consumer technologies could operate and play nicely with other types of technologies. Now, again, this is all consumer facing. It's not to say that this will necessarily happen in the enterprise tech space, but it does make you wonder, because we're starting to see some of the same behaviors from big tech companies in the enterprise tech space. You have to wonder if companies like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, if they will face some of the same scrutiny as Google and Microsoft did at the consumer level. What's sort of your non-legal knee-jerk reactions to that, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, from a non-legal perspective, I think the Digital Markets Act in general, and let me preface this with, I'm an American attorney and I focus primarily on U.S. regulations and U.S. laws, but we practice in a global environment, and that's the environment that we all live in and we do business in, and you've got to be aware of these things. And I think, from a regulatory standpoint, my view is that the Digital Markets Act has been relatively effective in leveling the playing field and protecting consumers in the way that it was intended. And I think it does really foreshadow what is coming for the enterprise market. And, we kind of laugh and say, well, the government regulators don't really care about business to business transactions. And I think that is true. Businesses are deemed to be sophisticated purchasers of these technology services, but in reality that's not necessarily true. And I think the likelihood that you're going to be involved in software negotiation or a large scale digital transformation project more than once or twice in your career is probably not very high. And so you're coming to this with one hand tied behind your back, so to speak, and the vendors have really all the leverage. And you want to look at, if you want to know where we're going, kind of look at where we're at now and where we've been. And I think there has really just been a lot of bad behavior in the enterprise space. And it's really across the board. You look at SAP, you look at Oracle, you look at Infor, in the way that they're trying to, capitalize on their market, generate additional revenue, and all of that is really going to make government regulators look at them with a jaundiced eye and want to do something about it. And I think that is what is down the pipe here. How fast it's going to happen, I don't know. I think there's going to be, there's political implications in the United States with regulations in the government's current stance on regulating tech, but I certainly think it's coming. And I do think it's going to be generally a positive development for the consumers of large enterprise scale software.
Yeah. And I think as a buyer too, we don't necessarily need to wait for the government to do something. I think there's a lot of behavior that I would argue is just as much the fault of the enterprise tech buyers as it is the enterprise tech providers, in that they sort of allow this sort of behavior. And I think that's what gets a lot of companies into trouble, is they take what a vendor sells them at face value. Maybe they feel like they have to upgrade to the cloud now because the tech providers are telling them they have to, or maybe they feel like they have to go all in on one solution versus a best of breed interoperable model, whatever. There's a lot of different things that a lot of times leaders just defer to what the software vendors are telling them. And so, I think that the key takeaway, or one of the key takeaways that I want to keep coming back to here today, is that you have choices as a buyer, and you're the one that's ultimately, you got to determine what's right for your organization. But I do think, to your point, I think government probably will step in at some point in the future. I just wouldn't wait for it to happen, to make the decision that makes the most sense for you and mitigate the risk the way you need to.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at this, with the old, caveat emptor perspective, buyer beware. And you just, the reality is, you can't believe the salespeople. You have to take everything that they're telling you with a grain of salt. You look at these contracts, and there's a lot more that can be negotiated in these agreements that people are not negotiating, that they really have to focus on and do their best to level the playing field. And I think it's hard when you're dealing with these large enterprise players, SAP, Oracle, Infor, Microsoft. How much leverage do you really have? And the reality is, I think you have more than you think you have. And without a doubt, as you're entering into a relationship with them, it's probably the most time you're going, the time you will have the most leverage in negotiating with them. And you've got to think prospectively and make sure you use that leverage to your advantage, not only for the project that is immediately at hand, but to govern that relationship for the duration of the life cycle of the product that you're licensing. I mean, it's not just a one-time thing here, right? As you negotiate these, you've got to put all the stopgaps in there to really govern that relationship for the next 10, 15 years and think that far ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Because these are long-term decisions. And now more than ever, you're making decisions and signing contracts that are increasingly hard to get out of. And the switching costs are going way up. And I think I think that's where the real pain is going to be felt in this industry, is when we see the next wave of ERP replacements or big enterprise tech replacements, where you've gone all in on the cloud, all your data's in the cloud, you've adopted these pre-configurations or whatever that the vendors provide you, and now you decide, okay, that worked for a while, but now we've outgrown it, or we found a better option. It's going to be super hard to switch to get out of that. In some cases, it's going to be cost prohibitive, and I think that's where the real pain is going to be felt, and where we might start to see some of these regulatory actions.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's very much by design right now, right? I mean, there's incredible pressure, and a lot of times, I think they coerce their customers into transitioning from on-prem to cloud, or doing some sort of a major upgrade, which really isn't an upgrade at all, and they're utilizing every contractual trick and pain point that they have in those contracts to their advantage to get you to a revenue generating point. If you're pushing back on upgrading, you're pushing back on moving to the cloud, they have to find a way to generate additional revenue for you, and they're going to use that contract to their advantage. And that can be through audits, through termination rights, transition assistance, whatever it is, they will find a way to create a revenue generating event from you. And I think that is the kind of bad coercive behavior that people are going to look at, and would drive government agencies towards kind of trying to implement some sort of a regulatory framework with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to get to a few audience comments here. We've got D. Smith on YouTube joining from the Netherlands, part of the EU, obviously. So this is right up your alley and more directly related to you, some of the stuff we're going to talk about here today. We've got Jorge joining from Monterrey, Mexico. Dr. Poland joining from Mauritius in the EMEA region. And then D. Smith commented or answered my question earlier, which is, do you think this space should be regulated or more regulated than it is now? And D. Smith on YouTube says yes for specific industries like finance, public sector, and pharma. Makes a lot of sense. I imagine public sector might be, or potentially healthcare or pharma, something that has more direct consumer impact. I imagine it would make sense that might be the first to get regulated if part of this industry is going to get regulated. And then I think from there, the dominoes continue to fall potentially, once you start in a certain industry. Keep in mind, again, this is more of my legal, since I'm with an attorney here, I feel like I have to give all these disclaimers. This is us anticipating, speculating what we think might happen. These are not guarantees. Results might vary, or whatever disclaimer I need to put in here. Sundis from LinkedIn's joining from Dubai. Thank you for being here today. Jacob Mass on YouTube joining from South Africa. We've got Zablon joining from Kenya. Thanks for being here. Hello, Sanjay on YouTube. Thank you for being here. Ken's joining from North Carolina. We've got Barry on LinkedIn joining from Panama, and Craig on LinkedIn joining from South Africa. So good South African representation today as well. Just a comment here from D. Smith on YouTube. D. Smith says, true story. Coming from SAP myself, I know that it's all about the numbers. And with the 20/80 rule, the 80% of sales reps would overpromise and underdeliver. I tend to agree with that. I think that's unfortunate reality of human behavior. You do what you need to do to get a sale done. And if it means hiding some of the risks or glossing over some of the details, then that's what you do. I'm not saying it's okay, but that is what oftentimes happens there. And I think that's part of the behavior, especially when you're talking about these big multi-million-dollar contracts. That's the type of behavior I think that leads to potential regulation, or it leads to, at the very least, regulators taking a look at this and looking under the hood of how does this industry work and what needs to change in it. one thing I want to do is shift gears a little bit, Marcus, and show this other. I'm actually going to share my screen really quickly just for part of this conversation here. And the reason I want to do this is just to show you this report. It's really interesting, and I know Marcus has seen it as well, but just for the audience's take here, this is the cloud services market investigation in the UK. This is a report that was published middle of last year in the UK. And what happened here is in the UK, the CMA, I believe it's called the Consumer Market, right here, the Competition and Markets Authority, a regulatory body within the UK government, went in to investigate the cloud market, basically, and really focusing on hyperscalers, looking at AWS, Google, Azure, with Microsoft, and just looking at the power and the influence and the level of competition amongst these really big providers. And the really interesting thing here that they talk about is that they talk about the nature of competition in cloud services markets. They talk about how basically the competition or the market share is heavily concentrated with a small handful of hyperscalers. I don't think they use the word hyperscaler in here, but that's kind of what we refer to them as. But you can see that they focus on Microsoft, AWS, and Google and looking at their market share. And basically, to make a long story short, they've identified these three providers as companies that have a massive amount of control and power in the market. And when you get down to their conclusions, and they haven't yet given any sort of prescriptive recommendations, but that's forthcoming here in 2026. They say in this report that in 2026 they'll come forward with some recommendations of what to do about it. But essentially, what they say here is this sentence right here I want to highlight, because they talk about market concentration, which is particularly high in the case of infrastructure as a service, which is essentially these cloud providers. Barriers to entry and expansion are features that have enabled each of the two largest providers, Microsoft and AWS, to hold significant unilateral market power in the cloud services markets and to earn returns above the cost of their capital over a sustained period. Now, I don't think earning returns above the cost of capital is necessarily a bad thing. They have to make a profit. They have to get a return on capital. But I think the more important part here is that they're saying the unilateral market power. And that's where they're going here, is looking at, are there too high of barriers to entry? Are there possibilities for other competitive options in the space? And essentially what it sounds like they're saying is no, there's too high barriers to entry and there's not enough competition. In fact, they say right here, we think outcomes for customers would be better if cloud markets were more competitive. The outcomes would include more consistently competitive prices, greater prevalence of switching, and multi-cloud use, and potentially higher quality and innovation. One thing that's really interesting about this report, it jumped off the page at me. I don't know if you noticed this too, Marcus, but they talk about a statistic that says that less than 1% of cloud customers switch cloud providers in any given year.
Yeah.
And what they're saying is that right there tells you that there's not enough options and customers are getting locked in. I don't think they use the word vendor lock. That's another industry term that our industry invented, but they're essentially getting to this concept of vendor lock, talking about how hard it is for customers to switch cloud providers. So they get into some high-level, broad-stroke sorts of recommendations, but essentially what they're saying is that the CMS board is going to review further possible action and consider those actions in early 2026. So again, TBD on what this all means, whether it's relevant. It sounds pretty relevant to me. It sounds like they're going to do something. But the big question here, and by the way, this is all public record. If you just Google CMA Cloud Reports UK, you'll find this report. It's public record. I just found it on the internet through the UK government's website. So it's easy enough to find if you'd like to read it yourself. But it's a super interesting read. But what are your knee-jerk reactions to that, Marcus? And again, knowing that you're not an attorney that practices outside the U.S., what do you just think in general for the global enterprise tech space? What does this mean? Where do you think we go from here?
Yeah, no, I think it's hard. It's hard to predict the future, right? But this whole concept of the inability to switch platforms is true, and it's really shocking that is the percentage, right? It's fewer than 1%, and that's certainly by design. There's anti-competitiveness associated with it. There's potential antitrust violations. SAP was investigated last year, but I think the investigation is still ongoing by the European Commission for doing just this, where they make it incredibly difficult to have other third-party providers come in, provide support, switch to a different provider altogether. And that is all by design, and it's something that's been going on for decades. I mean, when I used to work at SAP, and we very much knew who was an SAP shop and who was an Oracle shop. And if you were an Oracle shop, you very rarely were going to switch to become an SAP or Microsoft shop. And it's very much the same today. And like I said, I think that is by design. If you look at the contractual framework, you look at the clauses and the restrictions that are put in these agreements, everything is really biased and works against you from a contractual perspective, making it difficult and making it costly to switch. Once you're on a system, I mean, how do you transition out, right? I mean, you're looking at at least a 2-year implementation, I would think. It's not something that you can easily do, and I think you said it earlier in our conversation. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around here, right? It's not just the enterprise providers, the software vendors that are doing this. It's that the customers allow them to do this as well. And I think if you don't regulate yourself, then the government's going to do it for you at some point. And from my perspective, I mean, I think I would rather do it ourselves. And how do you do that? Well, I think you've got to push back on these onerous contract provisions. You've got to use the consultants, the legal resources that are available to you when you're getting into these relationships to make sure that you are protected, and to make sure you've got the flexibility to do with that software platform what you want to in a way that serves your business. And it's all about obtaining as much flexibility as you can, despite that vendor's efforts to really put you in a box and try to create what I would call these revenue generating events from you as much as possible. I mean, that's how they view you, right? You are a cash cow to them. And that is a viewpoint that I think is going to get them into trouble, and is the regulatory framework that I would envision. And again, I can't predict the future, but it's going to be something about I'll say this from a non-legal perspective or a non-technologist perspective, but data portability, right? Your ability to own what you have put into that system, and your ability to do what you want to with it without restriction. Your ability to use third-party products to interface with that software system without creating revenue-generating events that are unreasonable, and to have some level of transparency into the licensing metrics. I mean, you look at the way that SAP's contracts are structured now, you need a lawyer to look at that. And we usually have more than one just looking at that contract. I mean, they're very complicated. And to understand how they're generating revenue off of that software, it virtually makes no sense. I mean, I will tell you, I mean, they can't audit on some of those things either. I've worked at some of these large software vendors in-house, and the way they come up with the pricing schemes is not particularly scientific. I mean, they are flying by the seat of their pants sometimes, and that's why it may not make a lot of sense, and there's ambiguity around it. But I think some sort of regulatory framework that could really cut that ambiguity out of the revenue generating aspect of the software, and prevent vendors from leveraging that ambiguity to create additional revenue generating events would be a good step in the right direction.
Yeah. And you bring up a point that I forgot to mention from the report, the CMA report. One thing they talk about is the use of multi-cloud environments. So they also investigated how many customers are actually using multiple cloud providers. And what they found was not many. There's too many that are all locked into one big cloud provider, and very few are actually using a multi-cloud environment, which some would say, well, why would you want multiple cloud providers to begin with? I think their view is that's not the point. The point is whether or not you want it or need it. It's do you have the option? And they look at the overall industry and say it doesn't look like companies have a viable option to do that. I'm here with Marcus Harris. We're talking about legal shifts and regulatory shifts in the enterprise tech space. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
When the soul of the city was laid to rest, and the night's forgotten.
If you're about to embark on the jungle of digital transformation, check out my new book, Welcome to the Jungle. It's a book that just came out in late 2025. It's my second book And it's a book that focuses on digital transformation failure case studies and talks about the lessons and takeaways from that. It's 300 pages packed of all the lessons and things that I've learned from having been an expert witness in lawsuits related to digital transformations, and also with our team helping clients recover some of their failed projects. I've included as many lessons as I could possibly fit into one book here. You can read this book. You can order it anywhere in the world in hard copy format, which is this format here. You can get it in paperback. You can also get it electronically as well. Scan the QR code right here or go to the links below for your copy. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think.
Are you looking for ways to promote your product or service to enterprise technology decision makers and influencers throughout the world, like the ones who listen to this podcast? Major Tom Productions creates media, events, and influencer marketing for B2B technology providers. Our productions are exciting, educational, disruptive, and effective. Most importantly, they create results. Our content is unlike any other in this industry, engaging, influential, and trusted by technology buyers and influencers throughout the world. Each month, our productions reach hundreds of thousands of targeted buyers and decision makers who trust and engage with our honest and tech-agnostic content. With long-tail viral results and engagement with our content, Major Tom Productions provides a way to reach your target market and create awareness, calls to action, and a connection with potential customers. So collaborate with us today. Learn how we can feature your product or service on podcasts such as Transformation Ground Control, Journey to S/4HANA, and Journey to Dynamics 365. We can also feature your brand on our YouTube channel called Digital Transformation with Eric Kimberling, which boasts over 100,000 subscribers and over 2 million video views per year. You can also participate in our in-person events, including our Digital Stratosphere Conference. Contact us today to learn more. We can tailor a marketing campaign that works for you. We look forward to helping more people learn more about and become engaged with your brand.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 256. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Darian and Chwialkowski. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. The show is sponsored by Third Stage Consulting and produced by Major Tom Productions. And if you'd like to learn more about either Third Stage and or Major Tom Productions, be sure to check out our contact information below. We're here with Marcus Harris. We're talking about legal shifts in the enterprise tech space. Let's jump back into the conversation. Another thing that you kind of you led into, Barry on LinkedIn, who's coming in hot today, saying the quiet part out loud. He says, if you think the push to the cloud is to benefit the user organization, you haven't been paying attention. And I actually totally agree with that. I think there are some benefits to the cloud, but the hype around the cloud and the focus, the myopic focus, the blinders, let's only look at the cloud focus is coming from the vendors because they make so much money and their stock prices do so well when they can prove cloud revenue and get that sustainable annual recurring revenue.
That's exactly what they want. And you look at additional ways they can make money, and SAP there's this concept of indirect access that has been around for a long time. And there was a case in the EU where if there's another platform or another machine or interacting with your SAP system, it would be deemed to count against your user count. Right now, that concept is pretty well established, and in reality, that makes a lot of sense to me, the way that those contracts were structured and are structured. But what SAP is trying to do today is create another revenue generating event where if you're trying to access your data in that system to train an AI model or an AI tool that is not an SAP AI tool, they want to extract as much revenue from you as they possibly can for you to do that. And where's the value add? Simply because your data is stored in their system does not give them the ability to charge you these exorbitant fees to be able to train a third-party tool. Now, is there a middle ground and is there a seed of reasonableness on their side? Probably, right? We could talk about that, and it'd be an interesting conversation. But the point is that these companies are doing everything they can to commercially exploit your use and utilization of their software. And at some point, it goes beyond, what's reasonable. And that's where the problem really is, right? When you start using contractual provisions and restrictions, and I'm thinking primarily of, audit restrictions, termination provisions, fees for assigning the contract. When you start using these in a way that goes beyond basic contractual enforcement, that's a problem, right? When they start using these to coerce their users into making a transition to the cloud, doing a major upgrade and saying, well, look, you're on the hook for, $50 million because of this audit, but we'll make that all go away if you do a $75 million upgrade or something like that. That is, violating what we call in the legal industry, the duty of good faith and fair dealing that's in every contract, and that is a breach of contract. So, there are mechanisms now, but I think, these guys play fast, loose, and incredibly aggressive. And, that's what's going to lead to regulation.
Yeah. Now, how about the fact you alluded to this just a moment ago, and I want to dive into a little bit more, but if a lot of vendors are doing this, and you could argue, if I'm a vendor and I could argue that I'm not doing anything wrong, this is industry standard, this is just how the industry operates. I use that as a defense and say, well, yeah, I have the right to do audits. Yeah, I can create this vendor lock, situation contractually, but so does every other vendor. So I'm not doing anything wrong. Is that what are your thoughts on that? That's where the one thing where I get stuck a little, because I've done expert witness work for you and other law firms. And I know that's a question that I get asked in court is, well, is that industry standard? And a lot of times, no, it's not. And then it becomes a big deal. And you and the other attorneys fight over whose fault that is. But if I say, or anyone were to say, yes, that is standard, does that make it okay?
Well, no, of course not. It does not make it okay. And I think, and we said this a few times during our conversation, what are we allowing the vendors to do, right? And I think this is where, these European regulatory frameworks can actually provide some beneficial leverage in the context of negotiation, because you can hold that document up, right? You can grab that and you can point to your vendor and you can say, look, the European Commission or whoever it is has said that what you're doing here is anti-competitive. What you're doing is unreasonable, and it's something that they're regulating in a foreign jurisdiction. Now, they may not be regulating it in the business-to-business context. It may be in the consumer context, but at least it gives you, some sort of a dog in the fight to push back on that when they're trying to do these things to you. But I also think you've got to go into this fully aware, and the document that governs your relationship with your vendor is the contract. And if you don't put adequate stopgaps, mechanism for control, and language that gives you flexibility, you're walking right into this. And in some ways, you're just as much to blame for the situation you get into as the vendor is, because you've allowed it to happen. And I think self-regulation is going to be certainly better than government regulation, but not everybody has the sophistication to properly negotiate these contracts, or the experience to understand what they're getting themselves into.
And that's why, hiring people like you or I and others to help through that process can be so powerful. And it certainly is a lot cheaper to negotiate that stuff up front rather than waiting for a failure or waiting for the government to step in and help you out later, because that may or may not happen. So you talked about, you started to talk about audits, audit behavior. And there's an article I just read last night, actually preparing for this interview. I went down a couple rabbit holes along the way, but one of them that I went down was around Microsoft and how they're announcing that starting this month in January of 2026, they're going to be auditing D365 user licenses. It sounded like that, from what I understand, it's the on-prem D365 user licenses. They're going to go in and start doing these audits. And we've seen a lot of vendors do this. You and I have talked about this before. I know I've seen it from SAP. I've seen it from Oracle, certainly Microsoft. We've seen it from IFS. We've seen it from Infor. Yeah. I don't know that I haven't seen this I can't think of any vendors where I haven't seen this, at least of the ones that started off on-prem and are now making this push to the cloud. a lot of these vendors are saying, hey, we come in, we do an audit, and by the way, you owe us $2 million for all the licenses you've been using illegally or, outside your contract for the last 10 years. So you either pay us the $2 million or here's a better idea, upgrade to our cloud solution and we'll make it all go away. And so I guess we see it a lot, and it's crazy. It's crazy behavior, even though they legally, contractually have the right to do that. It's just, I guess that maybe it's not a legal issue, it's an ethical issue. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how do we navigate that reality in our industry?
Yeah, and look, you've got to have clarity on the front end, and I keep saying this, but it's true. And you've got to be able to anticipate what's going to happen. And you're not just negotiating a contract for today, but you're negotiating a contract that governs that relationship for the next 5, 6, 7 or more years. And you want to have the price, the price caps. You want to have future options. You want to be able to switch out users or switch out functionality or modules. All of those things are some of the tools in the toolbox to be able to push back on the weaponization of these audits. And I think they do this purposefully, right? And the fact that you said they're going after legacy on-prem users doesn't surprise me in the least. And it's just for what you said, right? That they want to transition you to the cloud, and they want to do that because it's a huge revenue opportunity for them. That's I think it was it. Barry again says subscription licenses or perpetual licenses are worse than subscription licenses because they're perpetual, right? I mean, you're getting as the vendor this perpetual lease on the software, which is going to generate much more money for you over the long term, and that's exactly what they are trying to do. But I think they will weaponize the complexity of the licensing scheme. There's going to be a lot of ambiguity in that contract about how fees are generated, when you're supposed to pay, and you will do your best to be in compliance with that contract. But they will be able to point to situations where you are out of so-called out of compliance, and it will be a gray area, and they will use that gray area to your advantage. And this is prevalent, and it's coming up more and more. We just had a meeting in our software licensing practice group where we were talking specifically about this, and we talked about Oracle in particular. And I will tell you, I just sued Oracle for what we deemed to be an over-aggressive audit. Now, it was related to Java, so it wasn't in the context of trying to get somebody to switch over from legacy on-prem system to cloud, but certainly it was aggressive. The money that was being asked for was over the top, and the response was, well, the middle finger by my client, and we're going to take you to court. We did that, and of course, we put Oracle on their heels, and they came to us with a much more reasonable posture related to negotiating what they deemed to be the unlawful use of their software. So you don't want to have to do that, but sometimes you've got to stand up for yourself, and you got to push back hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to that theme, right now it's up to you, it's up to us to manage this. We can't rely on the government. But to your earlier point, a few minutes ago, if this industry doesn't learn how to regulate itself, it will get regulated by someone, and presumably it's going to be multiple global government regimes that'll do it. That's probably going to be a lot more painful than if we just figure out a way to play nice, be ethical and be above board. And speaking of that, here's another comment from D. Smith on YouTube. He says those hyperscalers cause the smaller niche players to be disqualified for not being on their marketplace when that partner might bring the best solution to the customer. And I bring this up, and I want to broaden this a little bit too, because there's a couple other legal issues that we haven't talked about yet. One is there's a couple lawsuits against software vendors, specific software vendors, for not having enough openness to their technology. So, for example, Celonis is suing SAP in the United States for basically blocking out their technology. And Celonis is a business process mining tool that goes into multiple technologies to analyze what's actually happening in the system and how people are using the system, transaction times, all that stuff. It's a way for you to understand how processes and workflows are actually working. So Celonis is suing SAP, saying, hey, SAP is locking us out to where our product can't work with SAP because they won't allow it to. And the reason for that, they allege, and one has to presume, is because SAP owns their own business process mining tool, and they want customers to use that. They don't want you using a third-party solution. Epic Software, which is an electronic healthcare record provider. I recently did a video about this. They're getting sued by, I forgot the name of the company, but it's another technology provider that provides ambient technology in the healthcare space. And they're suing Epic, saying that their ambient technology provides better, this third party ambient technology provides better health outcomes, but Epic won't allow integration with that solution because they're developing their own ambient technology that's not ready yet. So they're saying, they're going a step further and saying, not only are you harming us, the company, but you're harming consumers and their health. And so that'll be an interesting one to see how that unfolds. I think that one's taking place in the United States as well. So we're starting to see legal action against these software providers, basically demanding openness, interoperability, and we're starting to see more vendors provide it, despite all the vendors that aren't. We're starting to see companies like Boomi has become a big deal because they provide interoperability. They provide integration between systems. Palantir, Rapid, even QAD, the traditional ERP vendor, is now shifting gears and saying we're more of an AI interoperability software provider, not an ERP provider. So some companies are riding that wave of what consumers want, but others are resisting it and trying to block, kind of stop it from happening. So I don't know what any thoughts on that, Marcus, just in the way that are software providers obligated to provide openness and options and transparency and that sort of thing?
Well, to answer that question, simply no, they're not necessarily, right? But I think they open themselves up to these types of criticisms, these types of lawsuits. I did a video on the Celonis SAP lawsuit not that long ago, and I think that's a classic example of where the problem is, right? It's not because the Celonis technology was bad or it introduced some vulnerabilities into the SAP system. It was solely because SAP wanted their own customers to use the SAP functionality that was similar to the Celonis functionality, and they were going to make the Celonis functionality prohibitively expensive. And that's just unfair, right? That is unreasonable. Now, if you've got a reasonable basis for charging a reasonable fee to utilize a third-party product, that's one thing. But to do it only because you've got an anti-competitive, activity that you're trying to engage in, that should be taken to court. That should be illegal. And I think companies that are doing that need to tread very carefully. And the whole benefit of these platforms like Salesforce or these open platforms is that all these niche players can come in and make the totality of that system better. And that's a hard nut to crack for some of these vendors that have these massively closed systems. They don't want to do it. And I think if there's going to be some regulatory oversight, that's that's certainly one place to start.
Right. Yeah. Now here's an interesting. This is actually I love part of the reason I love doing these podcasts is because I learn from people like you, Marcus, and I learn all the stuff from the audience too that I didn't know. But this is from Lean on LinkedIn. Says, "What's your view on this? The EU awards an 830 million euro SAP deal despite looming antitrust investigation." And actually, while we were talking here, I just Googled it. I wasn't aware of this. I didn't know that the EU had just recently, as just a few months ago, embarked on engaged in a pretty extensive contract with SAP. And so you mentioned this before, Marcus, that the EU is investigating SAP for potential antitrust behavior. Right. We haven't really gone into that in a lot of detail, but I think that's another signal that we're seeing in the market, another smoke signal we're seeing. But I do find it interesting that despite the fact they might be anti-competitive, despite the fact they might be doing all these things, then the EU government turns around and pays, presumably it'll be a lot more than 830 million if that's what the face value is on the contract. What do you make of that? Because I wasn't aware of this. I didn't know about the EU signing this big contract.
No, I wasn't aware of that either. And I think that is one example of the hold that these vendors have on the user base, right? I mean, you don't have options. And I mean, you can look at this in a variety of ways. You can say, well, these guys are just corrupt and they're saying one thing but doing another. And maybe there's some element of truth to that. But what options do they have? These are the major players, right? There isn't, at least in the EU's view, in connection with awarding them an $830 million or $830 million euro deal, there wasn't a viable competitor that made sense to them. And did they want to use SAP? I would think from an optics perspective, maybe not. But there weren't a lot of options. So, they probably didn't want to use Oracle, an American company. And so then, who are you going to use? SAP is probably the premier European ERP vendor. So on one hand, it makes sense to use them.
Especially if you want an EU-based company. I mean, that really is your main option.
Right.
Very interesting, though. I actually read here as we were talking that as I was multitasking here, trying to dive into this a little bit more, I saw here that SAP, part of why they might have invested in SAP is because apparently SAP has also been investing heavily in its EU AI cloud and sovereign cloud offerings to support European digital sovereignty and data residency requirements, committing over $20 billion to the initiative. So that alone might be a good reason why they chose SAP, because if they've got the sovereign cloud that's hosted all in the EU and it meets regulatory requirements more than, say, an Oracle or a Microsoft or whoever they might consider, that could be part of it as well. But still very interesting. I don't know who that gives the leverage to, or who gives up leverage as a result of that relationship now, but it should make for an interesting unfolding of that whole antitrust investigation for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see this. I mean, these are not easy answers, right? I mean, there's no easy definable path forward on how to get out of this and to predict what's going to happen. I mean, you don't have a lot of options, and trying to make the market more competitive is really challenging. I think. I mean, there's how do you compete with Oracle, SAP, Infor, Microsoft, or any of these top tier players? I mean, sometimes the third tier just isn't good enough. And so what do? You don't have a lot of options but to go with some of these companies that are maybe engaging in some of this bad behavior.
Yeah. Do you think things are getting better for as far as buyers and leaders within organizations that are signing these cloud contracts? Do you think they're being more successful nowadays in pushing back on some of those terms than they were maybe 5 or 10 years ago, or is it more of the same?
That's a really good question, and I think it's twofold. On one hand, no, I don't think they're being more successful, and primarily because I think the software vendors have really circled the wagons. I used to work at SAP many years ago and have dealt with them on a negotiation basis consistently over the years, and I would say, up until about 5, maybe 7 years ago, SAP had a more customer-friendly approach to negotiating these types of contracts. They were willing to negotiate, they were willing to offer concessions, and they were willing to be generally reasonable in the way that they approach their customer relationships. Oracle's never been that way. Oracle has always been it's our way or the highway. If you don't like this, go somewhere else. SAP, though, I would say in the last maybe 5 years has really changed their position and become much more aggressive. They're unwilling to really deal with you. They're unwilling to accept reasonable concessions, and it's very difficult to negotiate with them in the current environment. And so I think what has happened is customers have become more sophisticated, and they engage consulting firms like Gartner, they engage firms like you, they engage law firms like mine to help them negotiate these contracts. But the willingness of the vendors to actually make concessions has gone down. And so, you've really got to prioritize what you're going to, focus on. And, I do think, though, if you're really only going to be focused on the amount of a discount you're getting off the list price, and that's the concession that you're really going on, you're really doing yourself a disservice, because all of these issues associated with flexibility, additional revenue generating events are going to come back and bite you, and you're going to end up spending much more money over the life cycle of that product than you would just by focusing on the discount. The discount is going to be small compared to the amount of money, extra money that you're now spending. So you've really got to push and fight to make these agreements reasonable. And it's not an easy thing to do anymore.
Yeah. So when it comes to documentation and internal governance and other areas of an organization's approach, what should organizations be doing when preparing for some of these licensing or audit disputes? If you, or at the very, let me back up and ask it, how do we avoid the licensing or audit disputes? What can leaders do to protect themselves and make sure they're not getting locked in and not subject to some of these aggressive audit tactics and other behaviors that you've talked about so far? What can we do to protect ourselves against that?
Yeah, on the front end, as you're negotiating these contracts, you got to give yourself a dog in the fight. You've got to have an appropriate amount of flexibility to be able to utilize that software in ways that make sense for you. You want to anticipate, use that's beyond the scope of what you're getting today. Whether that's through the ability to buy additional software, additional seats because you need them to leverage any future discounts that you've got if you're going to buy additional seats, the ability to trade out modules. It's all about this kind of flexibility without generating additional revenue for the vendor. If you can do that, you're going to minimize their leverage against you. Having some insight into how that software is licensed, how the vendor is making money off of that particular license metric is going to help you. A lot of times it's ambiguous. Now, what we will do if we're in the throes of an audit is, we want to really conduct a self-audit. And that's where having the documentation, having an understanding of how your organization is utilizing that software, having an understanding of a reasonable read of that contract, interpreting the license grant, the scope of limitation on use in a reasonable manner, and then generating an analysis of how reasonable is what that software vendor is asking for. How reasonable is it, right? Based on my interpretation of the contract, they're going to say, I'm $50 million. Well, not really. Based on our view and the way we read this contract, it's $1 million, okay? And so you've got to have the ammunition to fight back against that vendor. And then it really becomes a matter of picking a number. And if you're not happy with where that is going, you can always sue the vendor, right?
Right.
And there's a lot of legal theories behind, what are you going to sue them because? What are the causes of action that you're going to assert? And that's a different conversation. But that is very much an option. And nobody likes to sue their vendor, but you have to understand the vendors don't want to sue you either, and they don't want to have their licensing schemes, their audit schemes tested in court. So in my view, it's a nuclear option, but it's a reasonable option, and you can only sufficiently leverage it if you have done the due diligence on the front end, you've documented how you're utilizing that software, you've done a self-audit, you're able to push back on the vendor and have an articulate rationale for why their interpretation of the contract does not make sense at all.
Right. Yeah. Makes total sense. So what closing advice would you give to, beyond what you just said, any other closing advice you'd give to project teams and leaders that are trying to navigate or anticipate what might happen from a regulatory perspective, and how should we navigate our own legal risk or manage our own legal risk in the meantime? What's your closing advice?
Yeah, I think the takeaways are really two to threefold here. And I think, the first one is regulatory oversight is coming. And I don't know what it is going to look like specifically, but I think you can look to the EU for at least a playbook and to kind of have an understanding of what might be adopted here in the United States or in other jurisdictions around the world. And I think that can be a good thing. But I think in the meantime, you've really got to self-regulate. You've got to hold these vendors to account. And you can't look at these contracts in isolation. You're not just negotiating, a kind of one-time event type deal and you're done with it. You can't, so to speak, set it and forget it, right? This is a dynamic relationship that is going to be governed by this contract that is going to be necessarily imperfect. You're not going to have an understanding of the scope or your future utilization of the software. And you really need to think as prospectively and broadly as you can as you get into these contracts to try to avoid the restrictions that are going to be put in place on you. It's all about flexibility in the future, not incurring additional revenue for running your business the way you want to run your business. To me, those are the main takeaways.
All right. Thank you, Marcus. Great conversation. Appreciate you being on the show again. As always, a lot of good stuff we covered there. We're going to debrief on some of what we just discussed, and then we're also going to get into the mistakes that CFOs make during digital transformations and the things you should avoid. So be sure to stick around. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground.
I'm Greg Benton. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer with Third Stage Consulting. And if you are embarking on your digital transformation journey or in the middle of that journey in 2026, you're going to want to see our digital transformation report. This latest edition really dives into a lot of the key trends that we're seeing in the marketplace and the ecosystem right now. It also highlights a number of the things that are happening with AI being an important component and integral part of the ERP systems that are leading the way right now. Also, the shift toward composable and best-of-breed cloud solutions is really accelerating the decline of monolithic ERP replacement. The opportunity to download the report is found at thirdstage-consulting.com. And you'll also find other tools that will help you in the initiatives and the business planning that you're doing for 2026. Don't leave phase zero without it. Reach out today.
I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that'll allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 256. My name is Eric Kimberly, here with Darian Chwialkowski. And Darian, we just had Marcus on the show to talk about some of the legal and regulatory changes in the enterprise tech space. What were some of your thoughts, questions, and takeaways from that conversation?
Yeah, great conversation with Marcus today. Like you said, he's always on the podcast, and we love having him on because we always have so many questions whenever he's on. I feel like we never have him on enough because I'm like, Marcus, what about this now? But it was a great conversation overall. And I do have some follow-up questions, of course, based on what you guys were talking about. First off, being what enterprise tech is most likely to be regulated first? Is it going to be cloud, ERP, AI, licensing practices? Like, I guess that would be a great question for Marcus's opinion too, but I would be curious about yours.
It's a good question. I actually, as you were saying it, the one that jumped out at me was AI. I mean, I think despite what we just talked about with Marcus, the fact that cloud and ERP and, some of the behaviors of enterprise tech providers in general are leading us to think that there might be more regulation in the future, and there probably will be, but I think that might get overshadowed by the hype and the concern around AI. So actually all the stuff we just talked about with Marcus, there's a chance all that could take a back seat or become secondary to the concerns around AI, or I guess for the more aggressive governments that want to go all in on the whole enterprise tech regulation side of things, they might decide to do both or to do all the above. But I think AI more so not just because there's concerns around it and it's such a new thing, but also because to the point we discussed with Marcus, it's more of a consumer facing technology. And anytime there's consumer facing implications, that usually is going to get the attention of regulators faster and sooner than enterprise tech in general. So I think we'll get there eventually, but AI may end up stealing the show, at least as it relates to regulator interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question on that: when do software audits become conversive rather than corrective?
I don't know that they do anything other than be more coercive. I mean, it generally speaking, and keep in mind, I'll have to give a caveat here. I'm going to be biased in this response because of the sample that I have to work with, which is the clients that hire us. Clients that hire us are typically trying to get out of a jam, or they've got a concern that they have with their vendors. Not to say other companies that don't hire us don't share those same concerns, but I'm seeing more of that from our clients. But amongst our client base throughout the world, it's more coercive. I mean, the audits that these software vendors are doing, and especially in the last year or two, And I mentioned it with Marcus. There's a handful of vendors that I can name, and I did name in the discussion with Marcus. It's, all the usual players like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, even some of the tier 2 providers like Infor and IFS, which for the most part are above board, highly ethical organizations, but they're still even doing some of these audit practices to try and get consumers or customers to switch over to the cloud. So my personal opinion, maybe I'm a bit biased and a bit jaded, but my personal opinion is I can't remember the last time I saw one that was just an innocent, like, oh, it's just our normal time of year where we do an audit. Let's go ahead and do an audit. It's usually more of a strong arm tactic of, no, we're coming in to do an audit and we're going to look at the last 10 years of how you've used our software. We're going to come up with a big price tag and we're going to ask you to either pay it or migrate to the cloud, which of course we want you to migrate to the cloud. We'll make it real easy for you, or you can pay, this huge penalty for all the past licenses you've been using that you haven't paid for, which, to the point of Marcus, it's in their right. I mean, it's in the contract that they can do that, but I think the intent is important because they're doing it not because they have the right to and contractually, they're doing it because they want you to move to the cloud. And I think that's an important differentiation there.
Yeah, for sure. That's super interesting. And last question I have here, and that might be part of it actually, but why are buyers so reluctant to challenge vendors legally?
Well, a lot of times it's a leverage issue. When you're negotiating with SAP or Oracle or Microsoft, most companies aren't anywhere close to the size and scale of those companies. SAP is a huge company, so is Oracle. And so you just aren't going to get the attention of legal counsel, internal legal counsel at the software vendors to go out of their way to make exceptions for you. If you're a huge multinational organization, you have a better chance. But even then, it's a long, drawn out process. And then you add to the fact that your sales rep is so eager to close the deal now, they don't want to see you go negotiate back and forth. They want to get the deal done now. So they're going to pressure you as well. They're going to try and give you some sort of financial incentive to say, hey, if you just, let's forget all of these stupid details you're worried about. Let's just go ahead and sign the deal. I'll give you a big, massive discount to sign this deal by the end of the month or end of quarter, end of month, whatever. And we'll call it good. So, there's a lot of headwinds and pressure on buyers that make it very difficult to negotiate. And those are the two main ones.
Yeah, absolutely. But what a great conversation today. Like I said, whenever we are done talking to Marcus, I'm like, oh, maybe we have some more questions we could ask him. So we got to have him back on soon.
Yeah, he answers a lot of good questions. I learned a lot from him, but then he ends up leaving with a bunch of more questions, just like you mentioned. So I'm with you on that, which is probably why he's been on the show so many times, because we always have more questions for him. And so I appreciate him being a good sport and sharing his knowledge and experience. He's got a really interesting background. So thanks to him for being on again. All right. Well, we're going to shift gears and get to our last segment here, which is what mistakes CFOs make during digital transformations and ERP projects. And what are the mistakes that you should avoid, whether you're a CFO or any sort of leader within an organization or on a project team. These are the same mistakes you need to be aware of as well, but we're looking at it more through the finance lens and through the office of the CFO lens. So we're going to play you this clip from my YouTube channel, and then we'll come back and chat about it. So here's the clip of the mistakes that CFOs make during digital transformations. CFOs are oftentimes the executive sponsors. They're oftentimes the ones controlling the checkbook, and they're oftentimes one of the key stakeholders that have the most influence or input into what the digital transformation looks like. However, a lot of CFOs aren't technical people, nor are they expected to be. They don't necessarily understand some of the challenges and nuances of what they're getting into. So what I want to do today is share with you 5 things that every CFO needs to know from a non-technical perspective. I'm not here to get technical on you. I'm not here to talk about architecture and coding or anything like that. It's just the things that you need to know through the lens of a CFO that are really important. And chances are pretty high that no one else on your team is thinking about these things. So if you're a CFO, you need to watch this video. And if you're not a CFO or you know a CFO that needs to see this, be sure to share this video with them. And if you'd like to learn more about what executives need to know in general about digital transformations, be sure to check out our executive guide to digital transformation. It's a non-techies version of what executive leaders need to know about digital transformation to be successful. You can find that by scanning the QR code right here, or you can go to the links below. The first thing the CFOs need to know about digital transformation before starting is that digital transformation does not necessarily mean ERP software. 10 or 20 years ago, yes, it did mean that, most likely. But in today's day and age, there are so many different options beyond ERP systems. Not only that, and this is a point I'll come back to later in the video, but ERP systems are riskier than ever. There's a higher risk of cost overruns, a higher risk of failure, higher operational disruption, a lot of factors that have always been issues, but they've become even more prevalent here in today's day and age. So it's important to recognize that you don't necessarily need to rip out and replace your entire back office ERP system to embark on a financial transformation. If what you're looking for is better visibility into data and better reporting and better period end close results, faster period end closes, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to replace your entire ERP system. It could be that your back office legacy systems are fine, the transactions might be tracking data fine, but for whatever reason, the financial side of things is not working. It's not connected. It's not giving you the information you need. Maybe the reporting is limited. Maybe you don't have the flexibility to get real-time dashboards and things that you may want to run your business. So one of the biggest mistakes CFOs make is they think, well, I want better visibility into the business so that I can make better decisions and do a better job as a CFO. That's understandable, but it's also important to recognize that ERP systems are not necessarily the answer. It could be, but it could also mean that you look at other alternatives using your current ERP system as the foundation, and then looking at other, for example, financial reporting tools. There's products like OneStream that is almost like what Hyperion used to be. It's a financial consolidation reporting, financial reporting type of system. Even Oracle, who bought Hyperion, now has their own enterprise performance management tools that can stand alone or be part of the overall Oracle suite. And those are just two examples. There's a lot of different examples I could give you of standalone financial transformation or financial reporting solutions that may or may not require an entire ERP system. So the key thing here is to make sure you look at all of your options, all of your alternatives, assess the current data and the current systems you have. And if the data is there, but you're just having trouble getting information and making sense of that data, then it may be that you don't need a new ERP system. You need another financial tool to sit on top of that ERP system. McKinsey and other leading industry analysts and consulting firms have pegged the failure rate of digital transformation in ERP projects at 70% or more for decades now. That's a number that has not really changed since I started in this industry 30 years ago. And this is important to know because a lot of times CFOs are the ones that provide input into functional requirements. They approve a budget, they sit on the steering committee, but they don't necessarily understand implementation risk and what the real risks are. So I won't go into all the different risks you might experience in a digital transformation, but I do encourage you to check out my YouTube channel to learn more about what some of those risks are, why projects fail, and look at some of the case studies that I have on my YouTube channel of different companies that have failed in their implementations, and you'll start to see a lot of the same patterns. And a lot of times that implementation risk revolves around a few root causes, one being unrealistic expectations. Too often organizations expect that the implementation is going to go faster and cheaper than it really will. The second thing is internal misalignment. The team's not on the same page. They don't have clarity of what the purpose of the project is. They don't have a clear decision-making set of criteria. And then the third is that software vendors oftentimes will take control of your project. And that sounds good in theory because we want the experts to do what they're good at, but at the end of the day, it's your business and no outside third party is going to make those decisions or should be making those decisions for you. So a lot of times those are the root causes of what caused some of the other symptoms that companies experience, which then creates a domino effect that leads to failure, which is why so many organizations fail. So it's important to realize and understand what some of those risks are so that you as a CFO can lead the efforts to help mitigate those risks along the way. And this is where your skill set as a skeptical and risk-focused person can come in handy in a digital transformation. Perhaps the most overlooked risk of any digital transformation isn't choosing the wrong software. It's not even the risk of the implementation itself failing. It's the risk of your operations grinding to a halt because the implementation failed. And this is one that organizations rarely, if ever, think to quantify. We do quantify how long the project's taking. We'll quantify the budget. We'll know the minute we've gone over budget or missed a milestone. But rarely is anyone looking past the finish line to post go live to look at what will our operations look like. I mean, this risk will cost you exponentially more than the implementation cost in risk. Our research shows that the impact of operational risk after go live can cost anywhere from 4 to 5 times what the actual implementation cost was. So in other words, if you spend $10 million on an implementation, an operational disruption could cost you anywhere from $30 to $50 million on top of that. And that is because if the project doesn't go well and your people aren't using the system the way it was built and the processes and the technology aren't aligned and it hasn't been thoroughly tested, all that stuff, what ends up happening is you can't ship product, you can't close the books, which is every CFO's nightmare, or you can't run payroll. Those are the three biggest material operational disruptions. And our research shows that just over 50% of implementations lead to material operational disruption that can last anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. So when you're managing risk and looking at the overall risk profile, it's important not to get too myopically focused on the implementation time and cost and risk, although that is important. You don't want to do that, though, without looking at what that means to the operational risk. Because chances are pretty high you could speed up your implementation, you could cut some things out of budget, but the question you'd have to ask yourself then is, what does that do to the risk profile of the post-go-live environment? Another dimension of digital transformation that is oftentimes overlooked is the financial impact that the acquisition of new software has on your balance sheet and your profit and loss statement, but mainly your balance sheet. We talked about implementation costs, and operational risks, and how that might affect your overall cost and spending profile. But what's lesser understood is the fact that most organizations that are investing in cloud solutions are shifting from a situation where they have a capital expenditure and a capital investment in on-premise systems that they've fully depreciated in many cases, and there's just a small incremental ongoing maintenance cost associated with that. Now they're shifting from that model to a lower CapEx and a higher OpEx cost. So the operating expenditures are higher year over year, and those OpEx costs are likely to go up. They're not likely to stay the same or go down. In fact, it's almost impossible that they will unless you negotiate some kind of crazy deal after the fact. Chances are pretty high it's going to escalate more than you'd like. So this is a balance sheet and a profitability issue that CFOs need to be aware of. And you do have to ask yourself, through the lens of the CFO, is that the right investment for your business? When you've got a fully depreciated asset over here that's still delivering value, you have to ask yourself, is it worth the increase in operating expenses over here? Or is there a way to reduce or minimize the amount of operating expenses over here so that we don't have to materially increase our IT spend year over year? Now, of course, this all comes down to business case, comes down to the ROI, it comes down to the business value you might actually get out of the investment in whatever direction you go, but it is important to understand and look at it through the lens of balance sheet and P&L as well. For many of you, the CFO office is responsible for intellectual property. That's something that many of you are responsible for in some way. And something that's not talked about a lot in the technology space is how in the on-premise environment that companies grew up in, they spent a lot of time and money investing in intellectual property in the form of customizing that software and modifying that software to fit their specific needs and to give them a unique competitive advantage. Now, the techno-types in the industry, the consultants, the sales reps trying to sell you software will say, well, that's just technical debt. You should have never customized in the first place. Set that aside, because there might be some truth to that, but there's probably a lot of misinformation behind that too, because chances are pretty high that you modified the software because there was a real material business need that makes you more competitive and more unique to your customers, and it gives you an advantage. So the question you have to ask is, are we willing to water down that intellectual property, that competitive advantage, in the name of moving to a more vanilla cloud standard solution that has a lot less flexibility, and even if you can customize a software or change it to fit your business needs, you're going to have to reinvest that money to do it again. Now, again, the techno-types, the consultants, the sales reps are going to tell you, well, you've got technical debt you need to get rid of, you want to be future-proof. That's just marketing nonsense. Ignore it. Look at it from an objective, non-emotional perspective, like CFOs are typically good at, and look at what the ROI is and whether or not it's really worth potentially watering down that competitive advantage that you once had, and whether it's worth abandoning the intellectual property that you spent years developing. Now, another thing that CFOs need to think about in digital transformation is internal controls. How do we put controls and governance in place, not just around the implementation, but also around just what this new future state operating model is going to look like? The technology could work perfectly fine, but if you don't have the right controls in place, your operations are going to be a mess because, for example, if you have employees that have the authorities to create a vendor and pay a vendor without any sort of segregation of duties, that's a problem. Technology may work fine, but that segregation of duties may be something that you're very interested in as a CFO, and that's just one example. So the CFO is really going to be the only person, or the office of the CFO is going to be the only group that's really thinking about how do we approach this from an internal governance and controls perspective to ensure that the way the system is being implemented will pass an internal audit, will have auditable financial results, will limit our exposure to fraud and other issues from not having the right controls in place. And again, this has nothing to do with whether or not the technology works. It has to do with whether or not the technology was implemented in a way that supports what your goals are and what your controls are for your organization. So that's a clip from my YouTube channel where we talk about the mistakes that CFOs make during digital transformations. What were your questions and takeaways from that video, Darian?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it was a great video, but I think just the core message I took away from it was CFOs don't need to be technical to de-risk transformation, but they do need to ask the right non-technical questions very early on. And I think that's just like such an important takeaway for all CFOs that are listening to this podcast and that video. The first question, though, I have for you here, Eric, is when a CFO wants faster close and better reporting, what's your decision tree for ERP replacement versus adding EMP or EPM reporting layers?
Well, it's a good question. I'd say the real simple decision tree would be, do you have accurate data that's accessible to a third-party solution? And is your ERP system, the system of record, is it working pretty well at the moment? Is it stable? Is it functional? And is it, for the most part, delivering value to your organization? If the answer to those two questions is yes, then I would say yes, EPM could be a really good solution for you to get more immediate visibility into the data you have, get more advanced reporting capabilities. And just to clarify, EPM stands for Enterprise Performance Management. So it's sort of like, it's not just financial reporting, like profit and loss statements and balance sheets, cash flow statements, things like that. It's more getting deeper into deeper analytics and information about how your business runs and the real-time situation of your company. So that's what EPM is. And so if you've got the backbone and the infrastructure, the foundation for EPM, then sure, that's probably a low risk, high value sort of way and a relatively low cost sort of way to get value out of the current investments you have. Now, if the answer to those two questions I mentioned are no, you don't have good data, and no, you don't have a stable and working high value system of record, then chances are pretty high you're going to have to think about replacing some or all of your back office systems first, and then potentially look at EPM as an add-on or extension of that. So those are the two main questions I'd ask: is do you have a functioning back office system that also has point number two, which is accurate data, and you feel pretty confident in the data you have in those systems? If the issue is you just can't get the data out of the systems and the reporting kind of sucks, but overall the data's there, then yeah, an EPM could be a great option. But if not, it may be a deeper issue that you've got to address.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And last question to kind of follow up and wrap it up here. What are the most common symptoms that get blamed on ERP when the real issue is either data, process, governance, or anything else?
ERP gets blamed all the time for it seems like a majority of issues. It sucks because I can't get the data I need, or it sucks because maybe I wasn't trained in that system, or it's not a good system because it doesn't do exactly what I want it to do. So I think ERP systems get an unfair share of the blame when there's potentially other issues at hand. More often than not, when we go into a company and we're evaluating a company, helping them figure out what their strategy to go forward is, a lot of times their problem statement they come to us with is, hey, third stage, I want you to help us figure out how to replace our current ERP system. And the first question we always ask and dive into is why. Not to be belligerent or stubborn or to, be difficult, but just to understand why is it? Why do you think you need a new ERP system? And a lot of times, I don't know if it's a majority or not, but I'd say it's probably close to half the time. It's you peel back the layers of the onion, you find it's not really your ERP systems that are a problem. The current system you have is actually fine, but you haven't trained people. The data is a mess because you haven't cleaned it up. You didn't migrate it right. You don't have the right data governance in place. You don't have the right workflows. You haven't turned on these modules. You own these modules over here. You haven't even turned them on yet. You haven't even implemented them. People are creating spreadsheets outside the system because they don't understand how it works. Stuff like that. I mean, sometimes that is the fault of ERP, but more often than not, or a lot of the time, substantial amount of time, it's something other than the ERP system itself. And if you rush to just replace that ERP system in that same environment, you're going to be unhappy with your current ERP system. It's a lot like relationships, friendships or romantic relationships. If you're not happy with yourself, you're probably not going to be happy with your partner, and you're going to cycle through partners and just continue to be unhappy, thinking that they're the problem when maybe you're the problem. I mean, it's sort of the same thing with ERP. You have to look at, well, what is the real problem? Is it the technology, or is there something deeper within that you've got to fix? And too often it's something deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's a core message that we repeat over and over again on this podcast.
Yes, minus the relationship advice that I'm giving there. The other stuff, yes, of course. But
well, I don't know, maybe that too.
yeah, no, that's outside the scope of this podcast. But someone else can handle that much better than I can. But well, that's good stuff. Well, thanks for those great questions and all the great content you've added here today, Darian. And thanks to the audience for the great questions as well. Thank you to Marcus Harris for being here. Really appreciate that. And thank you all for listening and watching. Be sure to share this with anyone you think might enjoy the podcast or benefit from it. You can see all the past episodes of the show at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And of course, if you'd like to learn more about how we can help you, if you'd like to just bounce ideas off of me and as it relates to your project and things you might be struggling with or questions you might have, we're tech agnostic. We're fully unaffiliated with software vendors, but we know the software vendors and the technologies really well. We do this every day for a living, so we'd be happy to bounce around ideas with you. My contact information is below if you'd like to reach out. So regardless, whether you reach out to me or not, I look forward to seeing you next week on the next episode of Transformation Ground Control. I hope you have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.